Welcome to the World of DaaS, a show for data enthusiasts. I'm your host, Auren Hoffman, CEO of SafeGraph and GP of Flex Capital. For more conversations, videos, and transcripts, visit safegraph.com/podcasts. Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri is co-founder and CTO of CrowdStrike and the chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Dmitri, welcome to World of DaaS.
Thanks for having me, Auren.
I'm excited. Now, how do you think about? I've always wanted to ask you this question. So, if you're the intelligence outfit in the United States and you've got some really great access to some sort of 0-day, and it's helping you on a particular mission, how do you decide whether or not to notify? Let's say it's a Microsoft or something like that. How do you decide to notify Microsoft to be able to fix it versus using it for offense?
Well, this has been the hard debate in the cybersecurity community for 20 plus years now, because what's changed in the intelligence community world, particularly in signals intelligence, is that the same systems that our adversaries are using, we're using as well. That didn't used to be the case, right? During the Cold War, the radio systems and even the computers that the Soviets were using were very different from ours. They were all indigenously built. But now everything runs off primarily Western technology. So whether it's Windows or Apple or other Western systems that are used all over the world, when we find vulnerabilities in them, we may be vulnerable to them as well. And it's a hard decision to make. There's what's known as a vulnerabilities equities process in the White House now that was established some years ago, that looks at each individual case, looks at the value gained from the intelligence you may get if you exploit this vulnerability versus the danger to, first and foremost, national security systems, U.S. government systems, and then the broader private sector. But, there was a really interesting research that was done by RAND, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, that looked at how prevalent vulnerabilities in software actually are. And it looked at disclosures of 0 days and how they're used after disclosure. And what it found is that most of the time when one actor discovers a vulnerability in a piece of software, it actually does not get independently discovered by any other actor, because the vulnerabilities are so numerous that very rarely do you have a situation where you know about something in a piece of software that's 50 or 100 million lines of code, and someone else is going to discover that exact same problem. There are a few occasions where that may have happened, but it's really rare because there's so many other vulnerabilities that someone else is going to discover. So the chances that you would collide on one is actually rare. But what often happens is that once that vulnerability starts to get used in actual attacks and that gets discovered, then whoever is getting attacked could reverse engineer it, figure it out, and then start using it. But we would get advanced warning of that oftentimes as well. And that's when typically the intelligence community would go out and actually disclose it and get a patch out.
Got it. But it does mean that, in some ways, it could mean once you start using these things, you have a limited window of time to get the benefit from it. Because your adversaries are, at the very least, are going to figure out these things and then they maybe use it as an attack, but they also may be able to use it for defense as well.
Eventually, that's very likely, but it all depends on how you're using it, how stealthy your attacks are. Are you going to get detected? Are you using it against 1,000 different targets or one? So there's a lot that goes into both figuring out how you do the targeting and what you do to actually protect that vulnerability. So, for example, typically vulnerability or an exploit that leverages that vulnerability will be used for a very specific task, maybe getting into a network or moving around to other systems once you're already in the network. So once you use that, can you automatically kind of wipe out any evidence that you've used it, sort of overwrite memory, make sure there's nothing on disk. So even if the attack gets discovered quickly, they'll not be able to figure out how you actually got in or how you moved around. So there's all kinds of tricks you can use to minimize risk. But yeah, eventually everything gets discovered, or most things.
But it sounds like from the way you're framing it that your framing is maybe we should hold on to these vulnerabilities, hold on to these 0 days for longer rather than patch them up.
Yeah, I've not seen anyone make a really compelling evidence-based case that patching those vulnerabilities actually makes us immeasurably safer, primarily because of the problem that, for all intents and purposes, vulnerabilities in modern software are infinite. Now,
Yep.
when you look at it, obviously they're finite, but because we tend to introduce new vulnerabilities at a faster rate than we discover and patch old ones, the universe of potential vulnerabilities keeps on expanding. So it's a little bit like a ship with 1,000 holes in it, right? If you plug in 2 of those holes, are you actually going to be measurably safer in that ship if you've got 998 other holes still sinking the ship? The reality is no. So that is the situation that we actually have with software and vulnerabilities today.
Okay, got it. Now, if we move to Ukraine, I was surprised that the cyber capability of the Russians didn't hinder Ukraine more at the start of the war. Like, is that something that surprised you, or were it just because Ukraine is so hard and you thought, okay, it wasn't it was expected to not be as bad?
No, I've written a lot about it. I certainly expected the Russians to do more than they've done in cyber in Ukraine, although they've done quite a bit. But I never thought that it would have any sort of decisive effect for 2 reasons. One, there are fundamental limitations to cyber. It's hard to permanently destroy physical equipment and physical infrastructure through cyber. There are certain cases where you could do that, industrial control systems, for example, but it's very, very difficult. And when you have kinetic options, you're going to tend to prefer that. And look, you've also seen how resilient the Ukrainians are, right? Since the start of the war, their infrastructure has been pummeled by Russian cruise missiles,
Yep.
ballistic missiles, Iranian drones, and yet the energy infrastructure is still up and running, even though substations are literally on fire. So if you have that level of resilience in your infrastructure, what do you think the Russians could possibly do to them in cyber to actually take it down? The answer is not much. And also, like, how much are Ukrainians going to care about a cyber attack that shuts down temporarily for a few hours, a
The
substation in
banking
a particular
system or
region
something.
when they're
Yeah.
dealing with kindergartens getting targeted, right? So the overall effect of cyber on the population and warfare tends to be very limited because you're dealing with horrific consequences from a humanitarian perspective every single day. So your concerns about the ATMs being down are not going to be at the top of your list when you're worried about your child being safe, right? And the other element of this is that on both sides of this war, both Russia and Ukraine, the weapons platforms that they're using today are mostly non-networked. So you have a situation where you have 2 relatively modern powers that are in conflict with each other, but they're not using sort of the latest 4th, 5th generation equipment like the U.S. is doing, and like China is going to do in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. So your ability to actually do something to a D-30 howitzer from the old Soviet days that not only doesn't have a connection to the internet but doesn't even have a chip in it is non-existent. But take that against the F-35, for example, the latest
Yep.
generation fighter jet that is essentially software with wings, and your possibilities multiply significantly to degrade its capabilities, to impact its logistics, and so forth. Those opportunities are much less available to the Russians in Ukraine, and frankly, for the Ukrainians against the Russians as well.
One of the questions I had for you is there a scenario where Russia had some great cyber tools but didn't want to burn them? I mean, if you're going to send a missile into a power plant anyway, you might as well just send you might as well just do the kinetic. Everyone knows where that is. Everyone understands what a missile is. If you have some sort of way of shutting that power plant down through a cyber way, you might burn that and never be able to use it again. So once everything went kinetic, they might as well just not do the cyber stuff.
Yeah, so this is a unique thing about cyber weapons. Is you're right that once you use them, particularly things that are not sort of stealthy and espionage focused, that are things that are intended to cause an effect like disruption or destruction, they tend to get discovered and countermeasures tend to be built. But again, just like with vulnerabilities, because this is software, it doesn't mean that, oh my God, I've used my one and only cyber weapon and I'm never going to have another one, right? There's
Yeah.
always capabilities that are being developed continuously. It's just software engineering at one level. And yes, you may use something, but chances are you're already in progress developing something else, or you may have already done it. So I don't think that there's like a massive stockpile of capabilities that they're sitting on and not using. I just think that
Okay.
they have two fundamental issues. One, it's really, really hard to have strategic effects in cyberspace, and even harder on an adversary that is not highly networked.
Now, if someone was going against the U.S. directly, the U.S. is an extremely highly networked place. Do you think we're uniquely vulnerable to cyber attacks?
Well, we are and we're not. So Ukrainian society is actually very networked, and in
Yep.
fact, in digital identities, for example, they're even way ahead of us. But what they've done really well, and the Russians have frankly inadvertently helped them, is because they've been facing this onslaught of cyber attacks since 2014. There were multiple attacks in the energy sector in 2015 and 2016, attacks on their elections, attacks on various parts of the civilian infrastructure. They've been able to build a lot of resiliency. So when their network is destroyed in a critical infrastructure, company or a government network, they tend to rebuild them in a matter of hours because they know exactly what to do. They have a lot of practice, muscle memory, and they're like, okay, let's go and get this up and running quickly. We don't tend to have a lot of those same muscle memories built in. So you look at the Colonial Pipeline, for example, which was a ransomware attack against this company that shut down the pipeline on the East Coast that supplied fuel to the East Coast. And it was down for almost a week. But the reason it was down was not because the cyber attack was so sophisticated. In fact, the cyber attack never actually got into the industrial control systems. It was limited to the business systems, the IT systems within that network. But the company sort of panicked. They didn't know what the effect would be. And out of precaution, decided to shut down the pipeline. And once they shut it down, they had never actually practiced turning it back on, the whole pipeline. So they literally had to fly helicopters over it as they were slowly turning the knobs on and turning the pipeline on to make sure that structurally nothing would happen. And it took a long time to get it back up and running because of that. But that was sort of in a peacetime scenario where you were taking every single precaution. If you're in a conflict, if you're in a war, that pipeline would be up in 1 hour, right? Because people would just say, you know what? We can't wait. We're going to take the risk, and we're going to
take the risk of something blowing up or leaking or whatever.
That's right. And the companies that I've seen that have gotten destroyed, even from a business systems perspectives, by either ransomware or these nation states attacks, like NotPetya attack from Russia or the North Korean attacks on Sony. It's very shocking at first, and people are sort of in shell shock in those initial hours of, oh my God, my email systems are down. I can't communicate. If my Active Directory server is down, I can't even figure out the phone numbers of people to call because my address books are gone from my phones. How do I do payroll and all those sorts of things? But within about 48 hours, they tend to figure it out. They realize that, computers are helpful, but they're not the end all be all, and you can still
There's like
operate.
a phone book somewhere that still exists.
Exactly. With pen and paper, you can hire consultants, you can get things done. It will be inefficient, but it will not be the end of the world. And these companies survive. And the effect on Merck is a great example, right? The big shipping company, they were hit by this NotPetya attack in 2017, which was actually a Russian attack on Ukrainian networks. Highly destructive, but then it spread beyond Ukraine to various companies that operate in Ukraine or had consultants there. And then it hit a number of major Western nationals, including Merck. And literally all their business systems were down. They couldn't track their ships. They couldn't track their the stuff that was on the ships, where it was supposed to go. But you know what? They figured it out. And backups were being brought back online. Paper records were being examined, right? It was very painful and inefficient, but the world didn't end and people still got their goods. So I think that's a lesson for us to all absorb that, yes, cyber can have effects, but typically fleeting effects. It can slow things down. It can impact operations.
Cause misinformation or something.
But it's
confusion.
really, really hard to achieve permanent effects in cyber.
Interesting. Now, as we're recording this in June 2023, Ukraine is planning a massive counteroffensive. What are their major goals in doing this?
Well, it has already launched it. So we're
Yeah.
recording on Friday. They launched it on Monday of this week. And the reason we know that they've launched it is that we're seeing a lot of videos of Western equipment like Leopard tanks and Bradleys that were specifically given to Ukrainian new brigades that were trained by the West for this counteroffensive. So we're actually seeing them being used. So we know that they're employing the units that were designed for a counteroffensive. And they're pretty significant armored assaults all along the front line in the south of Ukraine, in the Zaporizhia Oblast and the Donetsk Oblast. And the goal is clearly to cut off this land bridge or land corridor, as it's called, the highway that runs from the Russian western border in the south, Rostov, all the way through Ukrainian territory, occupied territory, into Crimea. That is really strategic for Russia because
You
Crimea.
cut off the land bridge, then basically it's very hard to supply Crimea.
Yeah, so there are options to supply Crimea because obviously they didn't have the land bridge prior to their invasion in 2022. So they built this Kerch bridge across the straits that helps to resupply it with a rail link as well as automotive links. But that bridge has been targeted by Ukraine. They also have ferries that can carry things over, but it's limited capacity. So that critical link not only does it provide redundancy for the Russians, but it also adds extra capacity for all the both civilians and military personnel that are in Crimea. So the Ukrainians want to get to the Sea of Azov to cut off that land bridge. And the other thing they would gain from this is actually get much of Crimea and potentially even all of Crimea, depending on how far they get, within range of their artillery, within range of their HIMARS rocket systems and others. And they would be able to continuously hit the Russian military bases in Crimea, Russian infrastructure, and cause them a lot of pain. And because Crimea is a critical supply point for the Russian forces in the south. There's a lot of naval assets there as well. They're supporting both the naval aviation as well as the maritime forces that are launching missiles at Ukraine. So keeping it within range would be a very important strategic objective for Ukraine.
And is the objective, you think, to retake Crimea this year, or is the objective to make it very difficult for Russians to resupply their troops in Ukraine?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure even they know. A lot of it is going to be contingent on how the offensive unfolds and not just how far they get, but also what kind of losses they take as they're incurring today. There are videos literally today of a bunch of Leopard 2 tanks that they got from Europe and Bradley infantry vehicles from the U.S. that are destroyed by Russian artillery that were participating in this offensive. So it's all going to depend on what state are their forces in to actually continue on and go into Crimea, and how the Russians may respond to this counteroffensive. This whole war has been a little bit of a chess match, right? You had the initial Russian invasion. It petered out last April. Then you had the Ukrainian, they continued in the Donbass in the summer, but they literally ran out of steam. Then you had the Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kharkiv in the north and Kherson in the south that were successful. Then the Russians tried another offensive this winter that resulted ultimately in the destruction and taking of Bakhmut in the Donbass, but not much else. Really was a major failure on the Russian part. And now it's Ukraine's turn. Once Ukraine's offensive finishes, you would expect the Russians to try to muster up forces to go again, and they'll likely need another round of mobilization to execute that.
And is it just kind of like we're going to see this kind of roller coaster happen for years, or do you think there's some sort of end state that they're going to work toward over the next, X number of months?
So that's really the $64,000 question, Auren. How does this war end and when? And to be honest with you, I have a hard time thinking through realistic scenarios for the end of this war that are in the foreseeable future. And
it doesn't seem like any side has like the core incentive to drive a conclusion.
That's right. Ukraine obviously wants to retake all of its territory, rightly so, not just to February 2022 borders, but all the way back to February 2014, when Russia took Crimea, illegally took Crimea, and took parts of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts in the east. So Ukraine wants all of that back, and it wants to also have assurances that Russia is never going to threaten its territorial integrity ever again. And from Putin's perspective, he is committed, I think, to the war to the end, because he's gambled everything, his own hold on power, perhaps potentially even his life on this war. He can't afford to lose it. So he, I think, is going to continue this for quite some time. I think there's a lot of optimism that is unfounded. I just got back from Europe talking to a number of officials there, and they seem to think that once this Ukrainian offensive finishes, then somehow both sides will get to the negotiation table and figure out some sort of deal of territory for peace. And I just think that's wildly unrealistic. Neither Ukraine nor Russia has any interest in that at the moment.
And so we're basically going to be in this kind of somewhat of a stalemate for a very long time.
I don't think it's a stalemate. I think it's really a war of attrition. And it's a question because front lines keep moving, right? So much less so on the Russian side. I mean, it's moving to the extent that they're typically losing territory. But in this offensive, they gained Soledar and Bakhmut, these small towns in Donbass. Ukraine is much more successful in their offensives. It's not really a stalemate, but it is a war of attrition because both sides are running out of all sorts of things. Manpower. Both sides are probably going to do mobilization waves to reconstitute their forces and retrain them after this is over. After this stage of the fight is over, both sides are running out of equipment. The Russians have used up thousands of tanks that have been destroyed by the Ukrainians, millions of rounds of ammunition, including artillery shells. Same is true on the Ukrainian side. They're being resupplied by, of course, the United States and Europe and other friendly countries, but those stockpiles are not infinite. And we're running low on things like artillery shells, for example, to give them. We're trying to ramp up production, but it's going to be slow going. Some of that extra production is not going to be online until 2025. So who can outlast who is a big question in this fight.
And what is this? What's the historical analogy? Is it 1917? Like, is there any good historical analogy that we can look to?
Well, I think it's hard. Every war is different. Certainly, there are elements of this war that are somewhat like 1914, but it's also a lot more mobile. Yes, there's trench warfare, but you also have breakthroughs that take place and gains of territory. In the last probably 6 months, it has looked a lot like the Western Front in 1914 because so little of the territory has been changing. But we'll see what happens now as Ukraine is trying to use combined arm tactics and maneuver warfare to try to break through the entrenched Russian lines. And, if they're successful, it's going to be a huge coup for them.
From a Russian standpoint, is it like, hey, maybe we just need to hold on for the next year and a half, and maybe we have a new president and U.S. president, and maybe things change? Like, what is their thinking?
Yeah,
because they're not going to win this anytime soon either. So, like, what's their sides thinking about, like, how they come out with a decent situation for themselves?
Yeah, part of the problem here is that the definitions of victory for Ukraine and Russia are not the same, right? If the war ends where it is today, with Russia having taken a big chunk of Ukraine, destroyed its infrastructure, killed tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands at this point, and really made Ukraine non-viable economically, just completely decimated its economy, Russia wins, right?
Yeah.
It hasn't accomplished everything it wanted. It hasn't taken Kiev. It has not been able to take over the whole country, but it certainly hasn't lost. But on the other hand, if the war ends where it is today, Ukraine certainly hasn't won, and I would argue lost. So for Ukraine to win, it actually needs to take much of that territory, if not all of its territory, back. And that's a much harder task than holding on to what you've already taken, which is the Russian position. But you're absolutely right. Putin is weighing out the West. It's not just about elections in 2024, although certainly they're hoping to get government in place, whether it's a president or Congress, that will stop authorizing military aid to Ukraine, or at least slow it down. But they're also just hoping that the West will get bored and move
Or
on to other
tired, or
problems, right? And we have lots of issues we care about. China-Taiwan is a major flashpoint that concerns us to a great degree. So his hope is we'll get distracted. Ukraine is not, he believes, strategic to our interest, and he can outlast us.
Clearly, so far, the biggest losers are Ukraine and Russia. Like, they're clearly the biggest losers. Who are the big winners?
I think China is potentially the biggest winner, because what has happened to China right now is that Russia has become completely beholden to them economically. Literally,
Is it like going to become a vassal state in a way?
in effect, it's already becoming that, because virtually all trade, major trade that Russia used to have with Western countries is gone, and their only exports in significant volumes are going to China, and a lot of their imports are not coming from China. So they're very beholden to China, and at some point, China is going to exert more and more influence in Russia because of that. At the same time, because they've been able to present this view to the global South countries that they're somehow a neutral party here, that the West is supporting Ukraine, Russia is attacking Ukraine, and they're just sitting on the sidelines just wanting peace. All that is nonsense, of course, because they are helping Russia significantly in this war effort. But at least from a diplomatic perspective, she's being able to say, I'm for peace, and everyone else just wants to perpetrate war. So he's increased his stature in the global South. And he's also increased it in Europe, because the Europeans somehow got this idea, particularly President Macron in France, but also to some extent Germany, that China can get Russia to the negotiation table and end this war, even though clearly China has zero interest in doing that. And they're currying favor to the Chinese. Lots of delegations from Europe heading over there, doing more trade deals. But certainly China is not hurting as a result of this or feeling at all isolated. So I would argue that they've increased their stature. And then to the extent that the U.S. is using its weapon systems and munitions that could be helpful in the Pacific in this fight for Ukraine, and supplying Ukrainian forces, and to the extent that we're using our funds to not build new ships and other capabilities that would help deter an invasion of Taiwan, but using them to send to Ukraine, that's also helpful to China. But, the U.S. has also gained from this, because when you look at it, Russia has clearly lost in that its military is decimated. It will not be able to restore that military capacity probably for decades. It has reunified NATO. It has expanded NATO with Finland and probably Sweden shortly joining the alliance. And we've done it at a relatively cheap cost, right? If you had gone to the Pentagon in 2021, before this war started, and told them that for the cheap price of about $50 billion, less than major weapons systems like the F-35, and without the loss of a single American soldier, you can destroy much of the Russian military capacity, they would probably tell you, where do I sign? Right? And that's what we've effectively done. Now, we didn't want this war. This war is a disaster for Ukraine, obviously, and we would want it to end. But we have, I would argue, achieved some strategic objectives here because of the miscalculations of Vladimir Putin.
And China, I mean, as has been going on, they have been increasing their stature globally. They brought the Saudis and the Iranians together. Do you think we're going to see more of an ascendancy of kind of China as a diplomatic power?
Yeah, they've been building up to this for years, of course. The whole Belt and Road Initiative was the way to spread their wealth and economic power to try to bring countries closer to their side. What's interesting, though, is that in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, they're actually turning people away because of their bellicose behavior, because of what they're doing in the South China Sea, incursions into Taiwan. They're actually getting the Japanese to massively increase their military spending. They're getting the Philippines, who up until recently, the last president, were buddy-buddy with Beijing, are now going all in on the United States, offering bases to us, and strengthening the alliance. So you're seeing countries in the region get increasingly concerned about Chinese power, Chinese ascendancy, and most importantly, the way China is behaving as an arrogant and reckless player in the region. So yes, they may be getting more friends in the Middle East and Latin America, where people are not concerned about Chinese incursions, but in the region itself, they're turning more countries against them.
You said that Starlink is the single best technology that's been provided to the Ukrainians during the conflict. Why do you think that?
Well, it's been absolutely essential for so many things. One of the first things that the Russians did, and the most successful cyber attack that they've launched against Ukraine, and arguably the most successful cyber attack that has ever been conducted in the course of a military campaign, was their attack against an American company called Viasat, a defense contractor here in the United States that is providing satellite communication services to a range of countries, including was providing it to Ukraine before the war. And they were able to hack into that company, distribute a malicious update to the satellite terminals that were based in Ukraine, largely based in Ukraine. There were some spillover effects to Germany and a few other places, but most of the affected systems were in Ukraine, and essentially brick them, literally in the first hours of the invasion. And that had a significant effect on the Ukrainians' ability to coordinate their troops, to coordinate their efforts. They had other systems, obviously landlines, radio, etc., but the Russians were also trying to shut those down through kinetic strikes and jamming and so forth. So that combined effect of trying to target Ukraine communications, I think.
Can you break it down? Like, how did they do that? Do we have any sense of how they hacked into these satellites?
Well, they didn't hack into the satellite themselves. What they did is they hacked into Viasat, and we don't know all the details because Viasat hasn't disclosed it. But from what we can infer from the information that has leaked out, is they got to the systems that put together the firmware updates for the satellite terminals.
Okay.
They updated them with their malicious code, and then it went up to the satellite through the normal update channel process, and then went down to the terminals and bricked them, right? So you don't need to hack the satellite themselves.
Yeah.
Typically, you hack the ground station.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, and that's how you do it. But because they were able to do it in the first hours of the war, I think it actually had a significant effect for them. Because if you recall, in those first 2-3 days of the war, they took a huge swath of territory. They were on the outskirts of Kiev. They took a lot of the Kherson Oblast, Zaporizhia, and in the Donbass as well. And the Ukrainians were not well prepared to withstand it. Now, a few days later, they started to respond. The Starlinks had come in, and they were able to use runners to communicate with their field forces and other communications channels. So that's when things started turning against the Russians, when the resistance started to really build up. But Starlink has been used not just for communication, both civilian and military, but has been used for artillery targeting. So what the Ukrainians are doing, and the Russians as well, but they're sending up these drones, typically like DJI Mavic drones, simple drones, in some cases something more sophisticated, flying over Russian positions, figuring out where the armor columns are, where the troop concentrations are, and then targeting them very precisely with artillery, because now you have the coordinates for that. They're also using them for counter battery fire.
So, why do you need Starlink for the drones?
Well, you need the drone to communicate back to the artillery positions that are far behind the front line, so miles away.
You can't just do it through radio or some other.
You don't have that much length, and also Starlink is hard to jam because it's using so many satellites. So you need to target it pretty precisely with jamming equipment. And, with a lot of radio systems, they're much easier to jam. So it's been really vital for Ukraine in many ways. And I would argue has had a disproportional effect on their assaults.
And where's the line from Russia's standpoint? Like they could shoot down a satellite. Like where's the line where they have decided it's not worth it, or it will cause too much response or something?
Well, the beauty of Starlink is it's really, really hard to shut down because it's not one satellite. It's like
You'd have
3,000
to take
satellites,
down,
right?
yeah,
And they're
or
really,
you'd
really
have to take
small.
down 30 satellites or something.
Well, a lot more because they're constantly orbiting in low
Yeah.
Earth orbit. So it's really difficult to do this kinetically. It's difficult to jam it. Now, Elon has said that they've tried to target him in cyber. We don't know exactly what they've done and how successful it's been, but they've certainly tried. But the other element of this is that I think Putin has just been very, very hesitant at escalating against NATO because he has seen what has happened to his military from Ukrainian forces, right? And how decimated his armed forces had gotten because of what Western equipment combined with Ukrainian bravery and ingenuity has done. So the last thing he wants to do is get into a conflict with NATO. And I think he's very, very cautious about taking any steps that would escalate that conflict. And that's why I think you've also not seen any significant cyber attacks against the West from Russia, which many, frankly, including myself, have expected.
How do you think of the divisions within Russia? We've got, the military, which seems to be somewhat at odds with the FSB. We have these different paramilitary groups. We've got Wagner. Like, how do you think of all these different players that are out there?
So this is not a new phenomenon. People are sort of surprised that you have all these different rivalries in the Russian system. This has been a hallmark of Putin's government since really the very beginning when he came to power in 1999. He loves pitting people against each other. He feels like as long as they're fighting with each other, it's hard for them to build a coalition against him. So he is watching this from his hilltop of Prigozhin going after Prigozhin, head of Wagner paramilitary group, going after Shoigu, the defense minister, and Shoigu doing various things to constrain Prigozhin's supplies of artillery when he was fighting for Bakhmut. And he's probably saying, you know what, let them fight.
Yeah.
Let's see who comes out stronger. Let's see who achieves objectives. It's going to incentivize them, right? Sort of that concept, Lincoln concept of a team of rivals that he's got, as long as they're not turning against him. And if you notice, as outrageous as Prigozhin is in his statements against Shoigu, cursing him out and saying he's completely incompetent and trolling him on a daily basis, he never once says a bad word about Putin, never once criticizes him. He knows that that's a red line he cannot cross. So that's what's happening. And it's really a feature of the system from Putin's perspective rather than a bug.
But are these things are there actual alliances behind the scenes? Is it the FSB saying to Prigozhin, okay, keep doing this, is good, we got your back? And so he feels he's got that, and so he can go after the military, or how are these things breaking down?
Well, there are definitely different power cliques in the
Yeah.
system. And Prigozhin certainly has what is known in Russia as krysha, roof, meaning protection. So people in the Kremlin that are protecting him, and otherwise Shoigu could smash him in a heartbeat, right, if he really wanted to. But he knows he can because Prigozhin has powerful sponsors in the system, not least of all Putin himself, but others as well. So yeah, there are different alliances that keep forming, and
Because we have the Chechens as well who are in this, and
well, yeah, Kadyrov is a special person all on his own. He's the guy that runs Chechnya, sort of a warlord of Chechnya. He is really all about himself, so he is not in any significant alliances, permanent alliances with anyone. He just wants to run Chechnya like his own fiefdom, like he has been doing for the last 20 years, and not be bothered and continue to get lots of money and support. So different people are out for different things, but no one right now, I think, is contemplating or certainly preparing to challenge Putin. And that's the most important thing ultimately is, can someone orchestrate a coup and get rid of this guy and potentially end this conflict? And I just don't see that being realistic anytime soon. But having said that, coups are always completely unrealistic up until the very moment they happen. So it's really,
Yeah.
really hard to predict.
In some ways, do you think people are preparing for it though internally? Are they okay? I've got my own little army now. I've got my own like. Are they more preparing for it than they were in the past, or is it just always like they're always like looking out for themselves and always looking for exit plans?
Yeah, I think it's more of the latter. There are no real exit plans. One of the things that Putin has done, I think, really well is made sure that everyone is complicit now in this war. And by tying everyone in, starting with that famous Security Council meeting a couple of days before the war began in February of 2022, where he went around his security cabinet and asked every single person what they recommend to do and whether they would support this war, getting them into the complicity of this illegal terrorist act. And now it's going to be very difficult for any of them to think that, hey, if we can just get the old man out, the West will embrace us with open arms and will forgive us for all of the war crimes and everything else that we've done to help do in Ukraine.
Now, you also you pinned a tweet that basically said China must be deterred. What do you think that means? Like, how can we do that?
So one of the things I spend a lot of time on working now is looking at the potential for conflict between China and Taiwan, which, if it ever happens, will be much more devastating than this terrible war that we're witnessing today. So back in December of 2021, really before most people were even talking about this conflict, I said, excuse me, before the winter is over, Putin is going to invade Ukraine. And I listed a long range of reasons for why I thought that would happen. I'm now becoming convinced that Xi is intent on taking Taiwan before the decade is out. And if that happens, it could literally be the start of World War III. We have President Biden on 4 separate occasions saying that he would send American troops to fight China for Taiwan, something he had ruled out at the very start of the conflict in Ukraine. But even if that doesn't happen, the idea that there would not be instant and complete decoupling from China, at least on the part of the United States, if not other Western countries, in the event of their invasion of Taiwan, I think is a pipe dream. And the economic consequences of that are going to be horrific, to say nothing of Taiwan itself. So this is literally the flashpoint that could turn into Archduke Ferdinand style impetus for a global war. And I say it's a global war because if the United States is involved in a conflict with China in the Indo-Pacific, in the Taiwan Straits, it's highly, highly unlikely to remain in the Indo-Pacific for a couple of reasons. One of the things that the United States is going to have to consider right away, if it's actually fighting China and it wants to preserve most of its navy in that fight, is it's going to need to shut down the Chinese Air Force, which is quite formidable. And to do that, it's going to need to bomb airfields in mainland China. Well, guess what? If we're bombing airfields in mainland China, you would expect that they would retaliate with strikes against mainland United States, ballistic missile strikes against our bases, for example, which, would not necessarily be nuclear. I think you could potentially keep this conflict at a conventional level, but still would be devastating, and it would only be the 3rd time in modern history where the continental United States has been hit, or at least United States proper, obviously Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, and then 9/11. And it would be completely devastating for everyone involved. China would suffer, the United States would suffer, the global economy would suffer, Taiwan would suffer. So I believe one of the most important foreign policy priorities for the United States is to deter China from taking that step, so that they would wake up every single day in Beijing, President Xi namely, and say, today is not the day. And the longer we can keep this off, the better off we are. He is turning 70 this month. He is certainly thinking about his legacy and how long he's going to remain in power, probably one more term. in 2027, 5-year term that he wants to be elected to. But beyond that, he's going to be up in age. And it's not clear that he would run again in 32. But, if we can get past Xi deciding not to do this, the hope would be that whoever comes after him may decide that maybe this is not so important, because Xi is really a different type of leader than one we've seen in prior generations of Chinese leadership, who all talked the good game of Taiwan should become part of China, but didn't do a whole lot to orchestrate that. Xi really sees himself as the new Mao, as someone who's going to go down in history as a historical person that reunified the traditional Chinese lands, Taiwan being, of course, a key component of that. He of course, took Hong Kong, breaking the agreement with the British to keep the one country, two systems going. And I think he is intent on doing this in his lifetime. But if we can deter him from doing so, we can avoid a catastrophe.
Why does it have to be why, from Taiwan's perspective, from China's perspective, why does it have to be a military solution? Why can't they, do a better job of getting the right folks elected in Taiwan so that they can more peacefully move it over, or even a pseudo military, do a better job of doing a blockade plus sanctions and stuff like that, and pressure them? Or why does it have to be a true military solution from them?
Well, I don't believe that they have any other options, because the Taiwanese people do not want to join the mainland, right? When you look at any poll out there, you certainly have people that are ambivalent about fighting China, wanting to appease China. But the people that actually say that we are in favor of rejoining mainland China and becoming part of the PRC, People's Republic of China, that's less than 6% of the population. So there's just zero support for it. And the Taiwanese have developed since 1949, really their own identity. Many people think of themselves as Chinese, but they also think of themselves simultaneously as Taiwanese, very different from the mainland. So these voluntary schemes, I don't think are going to work. So even the KMT, one of the major parties in Taiwan that is generally considered to be quote unquote pro-China, is pro-business relationship with China, is against declaring independence, but is certainly not for rejoining China in any sort of way, right? So they're playing this game of let's trade, let's build economic ties and tourist ties and the like, cultural ties, but let's hold off on any political discussions. And then a blockade, I don't think is going to work, because if China executes a blockade, sort of if you game it out, they're not, and they don't prepare themselves for an actual invasion of the island, which would be a massive undertaking, probably the most sophisticated amphibious assault operation in history of warfare, more complicated than D-Day by a mile. But if they just do a blockade, well, the United States, along with our allies, are very likely to run that blockade. And they're going to get into a potential conflict with us without actually having done any of the preparation to take over the island. So win or lose that conflict, they will not be able to go after Taiwan afterwards. So they're not going to accomplish any of their objectives, and probably turn most of the world against them, because Taiwan imports a lot of their food and energy. If you're going to blockade that off, you're going to have a humanitarian disaster on your hands that's going to play out on televisions, and they may turn not just the Europeans against them, but hopefully even the global South. So the blockade is just a terrible, terrible option for them.
Now, speaking of China, what do you think of things like TikTok? How much threat does it actually pose to the U.S.? How should we be approaching it, et cetera?
So I think the way to think about TikTok is not really as a social media platform. In fact, it's not really a social media platform. It's more of a video distribution channel, right? It's a lot more like YouTube than it is like Twitter or Facebook. Very few social elements are actually in TikTok. But the right way to think about it is as a media company, right? It is a content distribution channel. And yes, the content is user uploaded, but they decide what you see, right? Theoretically, the algorithm, or through moderation schemes, people at TikTok decide what you're going to see. And given that it's controlled by a company based in China that has Chinese Communist Party officials there, that presents, I think, significant dangers, both from a perspective of
because
what
they could push narratives to the U.S. population, and that could help
two
move
things,
the
right?
population.
It can push narratives, but it can also not show narratives, right? So what you don't see is almost as important as what you do see. And you don't know why that is, why that's not showing up in your feed. Is it because of the algorithm, or is it because someone actually decided to take it down, right? If it's a content about Uyghurs or Tiananmen Square or war in Ukraine or whatever, suddenly that disappears from the platform. And if you have people that are consuming TikTok as their only media channel, that's a problem. And look, traditionally, forget the internet, forget social media. We have had laws in this country for decades about foreign ownership of our media, right? So when Rupert Murdoch decided to come to this country and start the Fox network and get into the news business, he had to get American citizenship before he was allowed to do that, even though he was Australian, right, from a friendly country. He was not allowed as a foreign citizen to have that major news channel, not the Fox News channel, but the Fox network, that would broadcast to a significant portion of Americans as a foreigner. So why would we let TikTok, a Chinese company, have that capability? And by the way, it's not even about foreign ownership, but we have laws in this country about the level of ownerships, even for Americans, of TV stations. So, for example, you can't buy 50% of all the local TV stations in this country, even as American citizens. There are rules regulating that, right? So, given that TikTok themselves say that 150 million Americans, half the country, is using TikTok, they're making the case themselves that this is something that should be looked at.
And you think it's not like anachronistic law? Like in the UK, there's no laws around foreign ownership, right? You've got a Japanese company owns The Economist. You have all these different companies that, obviously Rupert Murdoch's company owns a bunch of things there. It's not and it doesn't seem like it's like been really hurtful to the UK democracy that you have these foreign companies own big media companies there.
No, I mean, it's certainly something that came out of the Cold War, and there were concerns about adversarial foreign influence, and I think it's good for us to regulate the amount of ownership, and then look at who can own it. Platforms that have widespread. Now, we still have the Chinese news channels here, the propaganda channels, CCTV, and others. That are able to broadcast in the United States, but they all have tiny level of ownerships. But if 50% of Americans were watching it every night, you can bet that the federal government would be looking very strongly into that.
When we think of these, back to cybersecurity, when we think of some of these threats, how do you think about the insider threat?
Well, the insider threat is the most difficult threat of all to solve, right? And some of the most devastating breaches you've seen in the U.S. government, certainly in recent years, whether it's Edward Snowden or whether it's this airman.
The Discord leaks recently.
With Discord leaks, right? They're all insiders, and these are people that have access, legitimately have access to systems. Maybe they exceed that authorization by social engineering their coworkers or whatever. And with that access, they're able to do, of course, a lot of damage. And it's really, really hard to prevent. Even harder in private sector systems, because at least in the government, in classified facilities, you can do something about regulating phone access. You're not supposed to bring phones into SCIFs, classified areas. You segregate classified networks from unclassified networks. Really, really difficult to do all of that in the private sector, right? And if you attempt to do that, you'll probably lose all of your employees. So it really becomes a incredibly challenging threat for companies, and particularly when you start thinking about nation states coming after you, right? So for the last 15 almost years, I've been focused on Chinese and Russian and Iranian and North Korean cyber espionage activity against U.S. companies, where they were trying to steal intellectual property, defense secrets, trade secrets, all sorts of things, mostly through cyber, through remote intrusions. And stopping that is difficult enough. But now imagine, as we're starting to see, these companies are bribing employees, using American citizens that have relatives in
Yeah.
those countries or heritage from those countries to try to recruit them. That becomes really, really difficult.
Some of them have direct intelligence assets. Well, almost pretty much all of the big ones have direct intelligence assets working for them.
Yeah, we've certainly seen at big companies a range of state actors recruit assets inside of those companies. So it's a huge problem, and you can turn your company into surveillance state where you're monitoring all of your employees, you distrust them, right? That's not going to be conducive to building a great culture. So it's a really
Yeah.
huge challenge.
And it's part of the challenge in the U.S. government, like the fact is you have 1.2 million people that have top secret clearance, and it's not clear that all these things need to be made secret. When everything makes secret, it's somehow less safe.
Well, there's a lot that's been made about the fact that so many people have security clearance. I don't actually think that's a problem. I think that's a feature, because every person that has gone through the security clearance process has been vetted to one degree or another, depending on the level of clearance, for your trustworthiness, right? And just because you have a security clearance does not mean you have access to anything. There is still a core thesis to our clearance process, which is need to know. If you don't need to know this, I don't care what your level of clearance is, you're not getting it, right? Or you should not be getting it. So just having lots of people on the books, having gone through background investigations, interviews, in many cases polygraphs, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because it's sort of a reserve cadre, if you will, across America of people that have been vetted for some level of trustworthiness by the federal government. The issue is how many of them should actually be having access on a daily basis to sensitive information. In the case of this airman, I think it's pretty clear that he really shouldn't have had access to this really highly classified information sitting up at his air base in Massachusetts. Same with Edward Snowden. He was a sysadmin. There's no reason for him to have access to really sensitive programs and the like. So the level of access is an issue, but it also runs into tensions, right? After 9/11, what was the main criticism of the intelligence community of why did they fail to quote unquote connect
But
the dots?
they weren't talking to one another.
They weren't
right?
talking to one another. So the more you put barriers on information sharing and communication, the more you're going to have those types of failures. And it's a very delicate balance to strike right.
To push back on you a bit, like you don't think the fact that like everything quote unquote is secret makes the secrets less valuable, the real secrets less valuable?
Well, there's a separate issue of, do we have overclassification in this country? And the answer is almost certainly yes. But there are plenty of secrets that truly are secrets and would get people killed if they were disclosed. And usually they're compartmentalized. They're not just secret or top secret. They're stored under special compartments, and only a few people can see them. But yes, lots of things that you would read at a secret level, you could often read about in the New York Times, and the way things are usually classified is based on the source, right? So if some secret source inside the Kremlin told you today what Putin had for lunch, that would be classified at a very high level because of where it came from. Now, the fact that what Putin had for lunch is probably like irrelevant. People would look at that information and say, well, why is that classified? That's kind of nonsense. But because of the fear that if that were disclosed in the New York Times today, someone could identify that source and get that source killed, you classify that. But I think there's not enough work that's probably being done to look at, hey, is this information already public? And does it really need to be classified? Even if we got it from a really, really sensitive source, is there now plausible deniability about how we could have acquired this information? So no one really goes through and does that analysis. And that's how you end up with all this information getting overclassified.
Now, since the invasion of Ukraine, I think so many of us have been reading translated speeches and statements or other types of news articles that originated in Russian. As a native Russian speaker, like, is there anything you see or you understand from the rhetoric coming out of Moscow that maybe the average person who's just reading the translation doesn't get?
So I think a lot of things are getting translated, but not everything. And the context in which things are said often gets missed. So there's now this very popular pastime for many in the West to read the translated TV show programs on Russian nightly television where they're saying all kinds of obnoxious and terrible things about launching nuclear weapons against London and starting World War III and the like. And what they don't appreciate is that the propagandists that are engaged in this activity do not actually represent Kremlin views. They don't represent the government. They're creating a show. They're being bombastic for a reason. And
it's like Tucker Carlson doesn't represent Joe Biden type of thing.
Yeah, or even Donald Trump, right? So
even Donald Trump.
They may be supporting them politically, but just because they say something on television tonight does not mean it was written for them in the Kremlin, gotten approved and put out. That's not how it worked. It used to work that way in the Soviet Union, but that's not how the propaganda works in Russia today. So sometimes people get overly interested in that stuff when it really doesn't matter a whole lot.
Now, do you think the experts are better at predicting events than the average smart person, or how do you think this tension between like the experts getting it wrong or the experts getting it right? How do you resolve that tension?
I think that expertise is really important. I'm a huge believer in Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. Unless you spent 10 years or so on something, you're really not going to master it. But there is a danger to that, in that you're going to get into your tunnel vision and you're going to make certain assumptions that you're never going to come back and revisit. And I think a lot of the Russian experts got the war wrong because they got into this vision of Putin that they thought was this guy that was, a bad guy, certainly a gangster and a thug, but played within the lines, and they couldn't see
him.
Uber
rational, maybe.
Well, I think he's actually very rational. But they didn't understand his mindset, that he decided to go after Ukraine, not because of NATO expansion, as Mearsheimer wrongly says, or because of European Union ambitions or democracy or, affiliations with the West or NATO trainers or weapon supplies. It was really that combined effect of all of that together, telling him that he was losing Ukraine and him saying, wait a second, I think this is mine. He's wrong, of course, but he's got that imperialistic ambition that Ukraine should not exist as a state. It's not really a country. And he feels like a gangster, that this is something that belongs to him, and suddenly it's been taken away from him. And he felt, I believed at the time, and I think got proven right, that the right way to respond to that is to punish this unruly, teenager or girlfriend, whatever analogy you want to use, that dared to disobey him.
And why do they think that so much more of Ukraine than of other former Soviet republics?
Well, I think he cares about other Soviet republics as well. Trust me, if Belarus right now was pulling away and going through the same motions as Ukraine had been, he would be doing that too. And in fact, when Lukashenko's
Azerbaijan is fairly independent, right?
Yeah, but just when Lukashenko was under threat from protests from an election he rigged back in 2020, Putin was the one that came in and saved him. He did the same thing in Kazakhstan. When Georgia was pulling away in 2008, he invaded Georgia. So this is a pattern of activity. Now, certain republics, former republics of the Soviet Union, now, of course, independent countries, are more important to him than others from a historical perspective. So particularly Belarus and Ukraine have been a part of the Russian Empire for a number of centuries. There's this theory in Russia that, the origin of the Rus, if you will, of Russia started in Kiev, and that these are brotherly nations. So they're way more important than others that are more Central Asian states, or the Baltics that are more Western European and have been part of Poland or Germany for a long time. So some countries historically to him, in his mind again, are much more important than others.
All right, this has been amazing. It's been a lot of fun. Last question we ask all of our guests. What conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
That's a good question. So the one I think is often bad advice, and it all depends on the context, is to follow your gut, right? You often hear people say, just follow your gut on this.
Yeah.
And that works really, really well if you're an expert. If you've done the 10,000 hours, 10 years of studying this topic, and your gut will generally guide you in the right directions because you've seen the patterns evolve over time. But if you're a complete newbie at this, your gut is gonna guide you in completely the wrong direction. Imagine if you're a new recruit in the military with zero training and you're sent into combat and people just say, just follow your gut. Well, you're going to get killed in no time, right? And the same thing in business. When you tell someone, a new entrepreneur who's never started companies, has never run companies, just follow your gut. Well, they're highly, highly likely to derail that company if they just follow your gut. So expertise matters, experience matters. And if you have that, then yes, following your gut becomes important, but it's not applicable to everyone. And in every situation.
I've found personally that even when even when I have expertise, following my gut to not do something usually seems like the right decision, but following my gut to do something doesn't seem like it's adding a ton of value.
That's a good point, right? So sometimes we're much more acute to negative patterns, what doesn't work, than what does work. And we fall into, I think psychologically into looking at a few examples and extrapolating way too much from them about what works. If you see someone, making a great stock trade, you want to rush in and do the exact same trade, even though the opportunity is no longer available and the circumstances are quite different. So you see this in many areas.
Yeah, certainly like to hire people or something like that. Like following my gut not to hire somebody, just something tells you something generally has been served me well, but following my gut to hire somebody without data just has not actually served me well over my career.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, this has been amazing. Thank you, Dmitri, for joining us at World of DaaS. I follow you at I'll spell it out for the audience, DALPEROVITCH on Twitter, and encourage our listeners to engage with you there.
Yeah, and also listen to my own podcast, Geopolitics Decanted. Available.
Absolutely. By the way, I love your podcast as well.
Thank you. I love yours.
All right, this has been amazing. Thanks, Dmitri.
Take care.